Once the concrete sets, that ugly hatch is gone for good. That was what Vanessa Cole said while standing beside a cement truck parked 10 feet from my storm shelter. The shelter was built into a low rise behind my house. Steel door, reinforced concrete walls, independent ventilation, emergency lighting. Enough room for 12 people. My father had built it after a tornado outbreak tore through our county more than 20 years earlier. It had been inspected, permitted, maintained, and used during severe weather warnings for years. Vanessa knew that. She also knew I had told the HOA contractor not to touch it. Yet there she stood in a red blazer, watching 3 workers pour wet concrete across the access apron in front of the shelter door. I walked toward her. Stop the pour. Vanessa didn't move. This section is being incorporated into the community drainage improvement. This is my property. The HOA has a drainage easement, 10 feet north of here. The engineering plan says otherwise. No, it doesn't. The contractor foreman looked uncomfortable. He had already asked Vanessa twice whether they should wait for the survey stakes to be verified. She had told him, proceed. I pointed at the steel shelter door. That entrance has to remain clear. Vanessa sighed. Ethan, nobody is using that bunker. It's a storm shelter. It's an eyesore. It's an emergency structure. It's outside current neighborhood standards. My property isn't in your architectural district. We are not debating this again. The concrete kept flowing. I pulled out my phone. Vanessa smiled. Calling your lawyer? No. I opened the weather radar. A line of severe thunderstorms was moving northeast. The National Weather Service had already issued a tornado watch. I showed the contractor. His expression changed. Vanessa barely looked. A watch is not a warning. No. I looked at the fresh concrete spreading across the approach to the shelter. But if that changes, you've just made the safest place on this side of the road harder to reach. She crossed her arms. The clubhouse has an interior hallway. The clubhouse has windows on all 4 sides. Our emergency plan has been approved. By who? Vanessa didn't answer. Then every phone on the site screamed at once. A weather alert. The foreman pulled out his phone. So did 2 workers. Mine read, tornado warning, take shelter now. For about 2 seconds, nobody moved. Then the county sirens started. Vanessa looked toward the sky. The western horizon had turned almost black. A homeowner across the road ran out of his garage, then another. A woman started yelling for her children. I looked at Vanessa. Then at the wet concrete between us and the shelter. Where exactly do you expect these people to go? Her face changed. That was the first moment she understood what she had done. But the tornado wasn't what destroyed Vanessa's position. The storm only exposed it. Because after the warning passed, county emergency management came out to inspect the blocked shelter access. And when they started asking who authorized concrete over an active emergency entrance, they found an email Vanessa had received 4 days earlier. An email telling her not to proceed. She had proceeded anyway. My name is Ethan Mercer. I was 46 years old. I owned a residential excavation and drainage company and lived on 6 acres outside the western edge of Briar Glen. My house had been there before Briar Glen existed, so had the storm shelter. My father built both. He wasn't dramatic about weather. He respected it. There's a difference. In May of 1999, a tornado outbreak crossed our part of the state. Dad and I watched the sky turn green-gray from the porch. At the time, the house had no proper storm shelter. We ended up sitting in an interior hallway under blankets, listening to the wind hit the roof. The tornado missed us. It didn't miss everyone. A church lost half its roof. 2 homes were destroyed. Several people were injured. 1 family lost a child. Dad never forgot it. That fall, he hired an engineer and built a partially buried reinforced concrete shelter behind the house. It had an inward opening steel door, vent stacks, battery lights, benches, bottled water storage, and enough room for neighbors if needed, he told me. If there's space, nobody stands outside. That became an unofficial rule. Over the years, whenever tornado warnings came through, 3 or 4 nearby families knew they could come over. No paperwork, no fee, no drama. They just knew the door would be open. When Dad died, I kept maintaining it. I replaced the door seals, updated the ventilation fan, installed battery backup, had a structural engineer inspect it after a tree came down nearby. The shelter wasn't some rusty hole in the ground. It was probably the best maintained structure on the property. Then Briar Glen expanded. The subdivision wrapped around the north and east sides of my land. The newer section had 107 homes, clubhouse, pool, walking paths, decorative pond, and an HOA. My 6 acres were not part of it. Different deed, different zoning history, no HOA declaration. There was, however, one drainage easement across the northern edge of my property. It was 20 feet wide. It allowed maintenance of stormwater infrastructure. That detail became important. For the first several years, there were no problems. Then Vanessa Cole became HOA president. Vanessa was 53, blonde shoulder-length hair, no glasses. And almost every time I saw her conducting a business, she wore a red blazer or red outer jacket. Vanessa loved the phrase, community standards, if somebody's fence was too dark. community standards. If a trailer sat in a driveway, community standards. If a teenager parked on the wrong side of the street, community standards. She first complained about my shelter during a landscaping review. She stood near the property line with two board members and pointed toward the steel hatch. What is that? Storm shelter. Operational. Yes. She frowned. It looks abandoned. It isn't. Residents have complained. About what? The appearance. It's behind my house. It's visible from the walking trail. Then tell people not to stare. One board member looked away to hide a smile. Vanessa didn't. She asked whether I would screen it with shrubs. I agreed. That should have solved everything. I planted native evergreens. 6 months later, Vanessa complained the shrubs interfered with visual continuity. I asked her what visual continuity meant. She said, consistency with the planned landscape. I reminded her my land wasn't part of the planned landscape. That ended the conversation. For a while. Then Briar Glen had drainage problems. Heavy rain started pooling near the newest cul-de-sac. The HOA hired an engineering firm. The engineers proposed widening a swale and replacing part of a buried drain line along the north edge of my parcel. I didn't object. They had a valid easement. I met the project engineer, walked the route, and showed him the storm shelter. He marked the easement boundary with stakes. The shelter sat outside it. Not close. Outside, he actually said. Keep this apron clear. We don't need anything near the entrance. I agreed. A week later, Vanessa sent me the project rendering. In her version, the landscaping path had been widened beyond the engineer's line. It extended toward the shelter. I emailed back. This drawing extends outside the drainage easement and interferes with the storm shelter entrance. I do not consent, the engineer replied separately. Confirmed. Construction limit should remain at the surveyed easement boundary. Shelter access is to remain unobstructed. That should have ended it. Instead, Vanessa decided the project looked better her way. The first warning came as a letter, not from the county. From the HOA. Notice of landscape and safety concern. It described my storm shelter as an obsolete non-conforming concrete structure adjacent to HOA-maintained drainage improvements. I called Vanessa. What does obsolete mean? It means the structure is not part of Briar Glen's current emergency plan. It predates Briar Glen. That doesn't make it appropriate. It makes it mine. She sighed. Ethan, we're trying to improve drainage and clean up that edge of the property. You have an easement. Use the easement. The shelter access apron interferes with the proposed grading. No, your proposed grading interferes with the shelter. We may need to cover a small portion. No, the door would still exist. A door behind concrete isn't very useful. You're exaggerating. I emailed her photographs, the old permit, engineering records, and the recent inspection. Then I copied the project engineer. His response was short. Do not obstruct the shelter entrance or access apron. This area is outside the approved drainage work limits, Vanessa replied. Noted. 4 days later, the contractor arrived. I was at a job site when my neighbor Paul Jenkins called. Ethan, there's equipment behind your house. What equipment? Concrete truck. I left immediately. When I got home, forms had been placed across part of the access apron. I parked and walked over. The foreman introduced himself as Mark Dwyer. I showed him the survey stakes. This is outside the easement. He looked at the drawing in his hand. This is what we were given. It wasn't the engineer's stamped plan. It was Vanessa's landscape overlay. I pointed at the title block. That's not the construction plan. Mark frowned. He called his office, then called Vanessa. She arrived 15 minutes later. Red blazer, leather folder, confidence. Always confidence, Mark said. Miss Cole, we have conflicting documents. There is no conflict. The property owner says this section is outside the easement. The HOA has maintenance authority. He has a survey. We have board approval. Mark looked at me, then at Vanessa. I'm not pouring until somebody verifies the limit. Good man. The truck left. The next morning, County Public Works contacted me. Someone had filed a complaint claiming the storm shelter was an unpermitted underground structure interfering with drainage. I laughed when I read it. Then I stopped laughing, because whoever filed it had attached photographs taken from my property. The inspector came out. I gave him the permit. He checked the structure. No issue. He also noted the drainage easement location. Before leaving, he said, if anyone is planning concrete in front of that door, don't let them. Already working on that. He wrote a note in the file. Later that afternoon, I received an email from Briar Glen's property manager. They had consulted the HOA attorney. The email said, until the storm shelter's emergency use status and property boundaries are fully confirmed, no HOA contractor should obstruct access. Vanessa was copied. Then the attorney sent an even clearer message. Do not obstruct the shelter access until emergency use status is verified. There it was. Her exit ramp. She could have stopped. She could have waited. She could have let the county verify what everyone already knew. Instead, she replied, the structure lies outside HOA emergency planning and is not recognized as a community shelter. Proceed with the per board approved landscape plan. I didn't see that email until later. But the contractor did. And apparently, Vanessa called Mark's office afterward and told them the legal issue had been resolved. It hadn't. 2 days later, the cement truck came back. The pour started shortly after 2 in the afternoon. I was home this time. I heard the truck before I saw it. By the time I reached the back field, workers were already placing concrete. Mark looked embarrassed. Ethan, why are you here? We were told the HOA resolved the boundary issue. They didn't. He showed me an authorization email. From Vanessa, it said, proceed with approved landscape concrete. All legal objections have been addressed. I stared at it. No, they haven't. Mark looked toward his crew, then toward Vanessa, who was walking across the grass. I said, stop the pour. Vanessa arrived. This has been approved. By who? The board. The board doesn't own my property. The drainage project has easement authority. Not here. I pointed at the survey stake. Your concrete is past the line. She looked at it. Those markers were placed before the landscape revision. Property lines don't revise themselves. She ignored that, then pointed toward the storm shelter. That structure isn't part of Briar Glen's emergency plan. It doesn't have to be. It creates liability. For who? For the community if residents assume it's available. Residents have used it for 20 years. That's exactly the problem. I stared at her. There it was. The truth. She didn't want the shelter because it existed outside HOA control. I pulled out my phone and checked the radar. The weather had been getting worse all afternoon. A line of supercells was developing west of us. The National Weather Service had issued a tornado watch. I showed Mark. He swore under his breath. Vanessa said, a watch is not a warning. Mark turned to her. Mom, maybe we should stop. No. He looked at the wet concrete. If we stop now, we can still pull the forms and clear the entrance. The project is already delayed, I said. Mark, you're standing on my property. I'm telling you to stop. He looked torn. Then Vanessa said, the HOA assumes responsibility. Continue. That sentence mattered. Mark told his crew to slow the pour. Not stop, slow. I started recording. Then every phone on site screamed, emergency alert. Mine read, tornado warning for Northwest County. Take shelter now. The sirens began a few seconds later, a long rising howl. Then another. The sky was nearly black. Mark shut the concrete flow off immediately. Vanessa looked around like the sound had personally betrayed her. Across the road, Paul Jenkins ran outside. His wife followed with their 2 grandchildren. Another neighbor, Sarah Miles, came from the trail with her 12-year-old son. They knew exactly where they were going. My shelter. Then they saw the concrete. Paul stopped. What happened? I didn't answer. There wasn't time. The fresh slab covered most of the approach. The steel door could still open, but reaching it meant crossing wet concrete and forms. I grabbed 2 sheets of plywood from my barn. Mark and one of his workers helped. We laid them across the wet section. Single file, I said. Paul took the kids first. Sarah followed. Then 2 more neighbors came from the road. Vanessa stood frozen. I pointed toward the shelter. Inside. She looked at me. What? Inside. Now. For all the anger I felt, I wasn't leaving her outside in a tornado warning. She crossed the plywood. The last person in was Mark. I shut the steel door. There were 11 of us. Battery lights came on. The ventilation fan hummed. The children sat on the bench. Nobody talked for the first minute. Then hail started hammering the shelter roof. Small at first, then larger. The sound was violent. Vanessa sat across from me. Her red blazer had a gray streak of concrete near the sleeve. She looked at the door, then at the kids. Paul finally said, this is the shelter you wanted covered? Nobody answered. Vanessa said, I didn't know the warning would. Paul cut her off. You didn't know there would ever be a tornado warning? She said nothing. The storm passed east of us. The tornado itself stayed several miles north. We got hail, high winds, and heavy rain. No direct hit. After 25 minutes, the warning expired. We opened the door. The concrete outside was ruined. Plywood tracks, footprints, rainwater. Nobody cared. County Emergency Management arrived less than an hour later because Paul had called them after we got out. That was when Vanessa's real problem began. County Emergency Management Coordinator Rachel Sutton came out that evening. So did a public works inspector. They looked at the shelter, the concrete, the drainage easement stakes, the HOA plan. Then Rachel asked one question. Who authorized work across the shelter access? Mark pointed at Vanessa. Vanessa said, the HOA acted within its maintenance authority. Rachel looked at the survey marker. This appears outside the drainage easement, Vanessa answered. We have revised landscape authority. Rachel frowned. That is not the same thing. Then Mark handed over the authorization email Vanessa had sent. All legal objections have been addressed. Proceed, Rachel asked. What legal objections? I gave her copies of everything. County permit, shelter inspection, engineer's email, property manager email, HO, attorney warning. Rachel read the warning, then looked at Vanessa. You received this? Yes, and after receiving it, you authorized the pour. We determined the shelter was not part of the HOA emergency plan. Rachel stared at her. That has nothing to do with whether you can obstruct a shelter on private property. Vanessa's expression tightened. Our concern was liability. Rachel looked toward the steel door. Your liability concern resulted in 11 people crossing wet concrete during a tornado warning to reach a functioning shelter. Vanessa didn't answer. Public Works issued an immediate stop work notice on the disputed section. The concrete would have to be removed, not because it looked bad, because it had been placed outside the approved work limit and interfered with emergency access. Then the county requested the full project file. That file created a second problem. The HOA engineer stamp plan never included the shelter apron. Vanessa's landscape committee had created a modified overlay afterward. The contractor had questioned the discrepancy. The HOA attorney had warned them not to proceed. Vanessa authorized it anyway, and she had used the phrase, "All legal objections have been addressed." They hadn't. The next morning, Briar Glen's board called an emergency meeting. Residents packed the clubhouse. Word had spread quickly, not because of the concrete, because 11 people had spent the tornado warning inside the exact shelter the HOA president had called obsolete. Vanessa opened the meeting. She tried to frame the event as an unfortunate weather coincidence during an otherwise routine drainage improvement. Paul Jenkins raised his hand. Coincidence? Vanessa continued. The project was not intended to compromise resident safety. Paul stood. You poured concrete over the entrance to the place my grandchildren were sheltering in an hour later. The room went silent. Vanessa said. The concrete did not fully block the door. Sarah Miles answered from the third row. No. It just made us cross wet cement during a tornado warning. That landed harder. Thomas Reed, the treasurer, asked the property manager to display the project timeline. First, original engineer plan. Shelter apron clear. Second, Vanessa's landscape overlay. Concrete extended toward the shelter. Third, my objection. Fourth, engineer response. Shelter access is to remain unobstructed. Fifth, HOA attorney. Do not obstruct the shelter access until emergency use status is verified. Then Vanessa's reply. Proceed with the pour. A woman near the front slowly lowered the HOA packet she had been holding. Another resident shook his head. Nobody shouted. They didn't need to. Vanessa had lost the room. Thomas looked at her. Why did you override this? She said. The board had already approved the landscaping package. Thomas answered. The board approved the engineer's plan. Another board member nodded. Not that overlay. Vanessa looked at the screen, then at the room. The shelter is not a community facility. I finally stood. It didn't need to be. Everyone looked at me. It's private property. I never asked the HOA to manage it. Then I pointed toward Paul. But if there's room during a warning, I let neighbors in. Paul nodded. I continued. You didn't make anyone safer by trying to erase something you didn't control. Vanessa said. That is unfair. No. I looked at the screen. You were told not to block it. Then at her. You did it anyway. That was the point where the room stopped being hers. The board went into executive session. I waited outside with Paul and Sarah. Mark, the contractor, stayed too. He looked miserable. I should walked off the job, I said. You stopped the truck when the warning hit. Should stopped sooner. He nodded. No argument. 40 minutes later, the doors opened. Thomas was sitting in the center seat. Vanessa wasn't. He read the board's decisions. First, Vanessa Cole was removed as HO. A president effective immediately. 4 votes to 1. Second, all landscape work outside the stamped drainage plan was suspended. Third, the HOA would pay for complete removal of the unauthorized concrete and restoration of the storm shelter access apron. Fourth, future HO. A work affecting private property would require written boundary verification and legal review. Then Thomas added something residents had specifically requested. Briar Glen would establish a formal severe weather plan. Not one based on assuming an interior clubhouse hallway was enough. A real plan, public shelter information, county-approved safe areas, emergency contact procedures. And if I agreed, a written private use arrangement allowing a limited number of nearby residents to use my storm shelter during tornado warnings. I agreed to discuss it. Not because Vanessa had been right about community access. She hadn't. Because Dad's rule still mattered. If there's space, nobody stands outside. Vanessa wasn't led away in handcuffs. What followed was quieter, slower, and much harder for her to dismiss. The HOA received a violation for work outside the approved drainage scope. Its insurer opened a review. The contractor documented Vanessa's authorization. The county required restoration and compliance verification. The board incurred additional legal and engineering costs. And Vanessa's decision became part of the official project record. She couldn't turn it into a misunderstanding anymore. The documents were too clear. The storm shelter entrance was restored within 10 days. The concrete came out. The apron was rebuilt. The drainage work stayed inside the actual easement. The HOA engineer placed permanent reference markers so nobody could pretend the line was unclear again. Then Briar Glen did something I didn't expect. They asked County Emergency Management to inspect the shelter for voluntary neighborhood emergency use. Rachel Sutton came back. She checked capacity, ventilation, door operation, emergency lighting. Then we worked out a simple arrangement. During tornado warnings, up to 12 designated nearby residents could use the shelter if they could reach it safely. No one owned access rights, no HOA key, no permanent control, just a voluntary emergency use agreement. I kept the key. That was non-negotiable. Thomas agreed immediately. The next spring, Briar Glen funded weather radios for elderly residents. They added severe weather instructions to the community handbook. 2 households installed their own certified shelters. The clubhouse received reinforced interior safe room improvements. Ironically, the HOA finally created a real emergency plan because Vanessa had tried to eliminate the one thing that already worked. 6 months after the incident, Vanessa ran for the board again. Her campaign message said she had been removed because she made difficult decisions during a politically charged infrastructure dispute. Paul forwarded it to me, he wrote. Politically charged tornado? I laughed. Vanessa lost the election. Badly. About 8 months after the concrete incident, I was replacing weather stripping on the shelter door when a white SUV stopped near the road. Vanessa stepped out, red jacket, no folder, no clipboard. She stopped several feet from the apron. What are you doing? Maintenance. She looked at the steel door. People still use it? During warnings. The HOA formalized that? Voluntary agreement. She nodded, then said, I never intended to put anyone in danger. I believe that. She looked surprised. I continued, but you were told the entrance had to stay clear. Her face changed. That project had already been delayed. That's not the same thing. I thought the shelter was outdated. You thought it was ugly. She didn't argue. For a few seconds we just stood there. Then she asked, do you really think the tornado warning proved you were right? No. What did it prove? I looked at the concrete scar where the old pour had been removed. That warnings matter before the emergency. Vanessa looked at the shelter. Then at me. For once she didn't have an answer. She turned and walked back to her SUV. She never stepped onto the apron. That was probably the closest thing to an apology I was going to get. Ending. The tornado never hit us. The funnel stayed miles away. And that mattered. Because Vanessa wasn't punished by a tornado. She was held accountable for a decision she had made before the Sirens ever started. The engineer had warned her. The HOA attorney had warned her. I had warned her. Every warning said essentially the same thing. Keep that entrance clear. She had multiple chances to stop. She didn't. That was why the Sirens mattered. They turned an argument about plans, landscaping, and authority into one very simple question. Where do people go when the warning becomes real? That afternoon, 11 people had the same answer. My storm shelter. The one Vanessa had called obsolete. The one she said didn't belong in the neighborhood plan. And when the phone screamed and the sirens started, nobody cared about community standards. They cared whether the steel door opened. The HOA eventually learned the difference between controlling something and protecting people. Today the shelter looks almost exactly the way it did when Dad built it. Fresh paint, new seals, better battery lights. The evergreens around it are taller now. There's a small sign near the path. Private storm shelter emergency access by owner authorization. Nothing fancy, just accurate. The first tornado warning after the new agreement came the following spring. I opened the shelter. Paul arrived with his wife. Sarah came with her son. 2 elderly residents from Briar Glen joined us. No panic, no wet concrete, no blocked entrance. Just people sitting quietly while the sirens sounded outside. After the warning expired, Paul looked at the steel door. Then at me. Hard to believe someone tried to cover this. I nodded. He looked toward Briar Glen, over landscaping. No, I thought about Vanessa's emails. The warnings. And the sentence that had changed everything. Proceed with the pour. Then I said, it wasn't really about landscaping. What was it about? Control. Paul nodded. That was exactly it. Vanessa didn't hate the storm shelter because it was dangerous. She hated that it existed outside her authority. Then one afternoon the tornado sirens went off. And suddenly the thing she couldn't control became the one place everyone needed. The concrete was removed. The shelter stayed. And after that day, nobody in Briar Glen would ever let one HOA president decide by herself which safety warning was worth ignoring.